Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Other 250, America from Below. I am Becca Economopoulos, Director of the Natural History Museum. For those of you who don't know us, we are a touring and online museum for the movement, and we use art and storytelling and public humanities projects to advance social and environmental justice. The song you just heard was Rebuild, the name of it. It's a collaboration between G.R. Grit, who is a Juno Award-winning two-spirit transgender Anishinaabe and Métis artist, and Sela, an acclaimed Inuit throat singing duo. They talk about their music as challenging colonial narratives and embracing both tradition and soulful futurism. It felt like the right way to kick off an event about public memory and the struggle over whose histories shape the future. Today's roundtable speakers will explore the contested terrain of American history in this 250th year of the United States, and the counter-histories that can help us confront the authoritarian politics of the present. This is the first event in a new programming series on place names and the politics of commemoration. It's part of our Words Are Monuments project, which we launched in 2022 to support grassroots efforts to rename or restore the names of historic and sacred places. The very first executive order that President Trump signed on Inauguration Day in 2025 was called Restoring Names That Honor American Greatness. It disbanded the Reconciliation and Place Names Committee established by the previous administration. One of our speakers tonight, Derek Alderman, was on it. And it also ordered the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America and of Denali back to Mount McKinley. This really shows us that, like school curricula, monuments, museum exhibits, the official map is a site of contestation. In the lead up to the America 250 birthday celebrations, we published a different kind of map. And today's event marks the launch of the Other 250, a counter-atlas, community-sourced of American history told through the names on our maps. Dozens of geographers and historians and organizers and community knowledge holders have written short posts exploring the histories and ongoing struggles that official commemoration leaves out. As you click on the map, you'll find stories of naming and renaming across many terrains: Indigenous sovereignty, Black freedom struggles, labor, migration, queer and trans life. And they show how place names continue to shape struggles over land, power, and belonging. There is real material consequence to the struggle over the commemorative landscape. So today's conversation zooms out from the map itself to the larger battle over history. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping. We would love to hear from you in the chat. If you haven't yet, please introduce yourself, your name, where you're joining from, any affiliation or field that you would like to share, and let us know what brought you to this conversation. And some logistics, please put any questions for our speakers in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can toward the end. And this event is being recorded. We will email the recording and a roundup of resources to everyone who registered. Also, a big thank you to the Mellon Foundation and For Culture for supporting this work. With that, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, the Natural History Museum's Director of Research, Steve Lyons. Steve, over to you.
Hello and welcome, everyone. If you haven't heard, this year marks the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And as promised, the Trump administration has seized the moment to redouble its efforts to advance an amnesiac view of the past, one grounded in the active erasure of the histories of racism, exploitation, enslavement, and settler colonial dispossession that lay at the foundations of the United States. With so-called freedom trucks crisscrossing the country, a so-called Great American Road Trip reality TV series led by Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy and his family, and a systematic purging of radical histories and justice-oriented narratives from Smithsonian exhibitions and national parks, the celebration seems like a parody of ethno-nationalist fascism, but it's far from a laughing matter for those on the other side of the far right's fantasy of American greatness. So today we want to make some sense of this conjuncture, a context that many have called unprecedented, but which, as all our speakers underscore in their own way, is neither the product of one man nor radically new. But we also want to invite you all to enter this struggle with us from the other side, to inventory not only the myriad problems we collectively face today and the histories that got us here, but also the counter histories that can help us confront the authoritarian politics of the present. Our speakers come to us with a wealth of experience on the front lines of what we might call the narrative struggle. Jesse Hagopian, as a classroom teacher who has been at the forefront of the movement pushing to integrate anti-racist curricula into public schools at a time when school boards are banning books and censoring teachers who dare to talk about racial justice or Palestine. Rebecca Nagle is an award-winning journalist and podcaster whose podcasts This Land and the new one, First America, dive deep into the struggles over Indigenous sovereignty and native land that have defined the past 2 centuries of settler colonial relations in the so-called United States. Derek Alderman, as a cultural and historical geographer who stood on the Department of Interior's derogatory names task force, which was one of the many committees abolished by the Trump administration as soon as they took office in 2025, as well as Becca, who's already introduced herself. So with that said, I want to welcome Jesse, Rebecca, Derek, and Becca. I thought we might start today by setting the scene with some impossibly big questions and ask each of you to weigh in on those impossibly big questions in a rapid fire 5 minutes each. Um, with that, the Trump administration is obviously simultaneously pursuing deportation, extraction, attacks on education, renaming campaigns, and censoring museums and public history. Why is the control over the past so important to authoritarian politics? So why is the current federal administration targeting institutions and infrastructures for public memory? And why now? Are these attacks just superficial, like meant to distract us from the real nefarious work of the far right? Or do they have material impacts in and of themselves? And finally, at the risk of asking a very leading question, is this unprecedented? And if not, in what ways? So do not feel like you have to answer each and every one of these questions. It's an invitation to get the conversation going by diagnosing what's going on today and where this current moment came from. So with that, how about I invite Jesse to get us started, and feel free to just jump in and respond to each other and so on. This is a roundtable, so we'll try and keep it casual.
Right
Jesse.
on. Right on. Thank you, Steve. And thank you to the National History Museum and the other 250 campaign. These conversations are vital if we're going to be able to build the type of social movements we need to defeat this rising authoritarianism. And so I'm honored to be here, especially with our other panelists and who I've learned so much from. And I think you asked the right question, and it's one that I wish the media would ask more often, right? I think generally Trump's attempts at censoring history have been painted as a way to distract the public rather than a fundamental prerequisite of instilling fascism in this country. and that all fascist regimes have gone after controlling the story that's told about their nation. And the struggle over history has never been a struggle over just yesterday, right? It's always been a struggle over tomorrow. And I saw this up close and personal when a few months ago I was invited to speak at Florida International University about my book, Teach Truth. And before the event, I spoke with Dr. Marvin Dunn, who invited me. And he looked at me and he said, "This event's going to be different than any other event you've participated in." And he was definitely right. He said, "This is Florida. They banned saying systemic racism in the classroom, so we can't be in the classroom." So he actually organized a series called Under the Learning Tree, and we had to do the presentation under a tree on campus because it was illegal for adult students in college to discuss certain ideas. And it was illegal for the teacher to say that systemic racism existed, even though there's no way to talk about chattel slavery and the founding of this country without saying systemic racism. And that afternoon reminded me, I think, of something essential, that authoritarians can ban books, they can censor classrooms, but they can't really extinguish our hunger for the truth. And Florida, unfortunately, isn't an exception anymore. There's a study from UCLA that shows that nearly half of all public school students in America today attend a school where the teacher is required to lie to students about race, about gender, about sexuality. These laws require them to mislead students. And now and it's not just the schools where these laws have been implemented that are impacted, because when a teacher gets fired for just teaching about the history of slavery, it sets a chilling effect in place. And now nearly 2/3 of teachers report self-censoring discussions about race and gender and sexuality because they fear political retaliation or professional consequences. And so this isn't simply a campaign against individual books or teachers or lessons. This is really a far-right campaign against historical consciousness altogether. And it really highlights for me what James Baldwin once wrote, that history is not the past, it is the present. And he said, we carry our history with us. We are history. And that's exactly why history is under attack right now, right? Because authoritarianism cannot survive if people understand that freedom has never been a gift bestowed by powerful leaders, right? It has always been something that ordinary people had to organize and fight and struggle for, right? And students, I think, are far too often taught a story of American exceptionalism in which freedom is just handed down by visionary founders or enlightened presidents, right? Or benevolent institutions. But the reality is that the abolition of slavery was achieved by generations of abolitionists organizing and also enslaved people staging the largest general strike in U.S. history, and during the Civil War, fleeing the plantations, joining the Union Army, and fighting to liberate themselves, right? We know radical Reconstruction created the nation's first even beginning of an experiment in a multiracial democracy before it was violently overthrown by white supremacist terror. You know, we could talk about the labor, like, why do we have an 8-hour day or a weekend or a minimum wage or child protection in this protection against child labor laws, right? All of these things have been won by social movements, and authoritarians like Trump and his administration are terrified that people will learn that history and begin to implement the lessons of how social movements were created today. So I'll just end by saying that, whoever controls the past doesn't just write the textbooks. I think they try to write the limits of our imagination, right? And I think our job as educators, right, as public historians, as students, right, is to make sure that people know that history was never written by heroes alone. It was written by ordinary people who refused to accept the world as it was and imagined a more free society and showed us how to fight for it, right? And that's really what I think our job is to do right now.
Well, if it's okay, I'll jump in. Um, and Jesse, really appreciate those comments. And Rebecca, what an honor to be on the panel with you as well. I think I would just want to echo some of what Jesse is getting at and talking about that, with the control of the past through the Trump administration, we're seeing a controlling of the lines of debate in terms of not just the debates we hold now, but the debates that we will hold in the future, 25 years from now, as we are not working from a full historical consciousness about what exactly has gone on. And I think to go to your question, Steve, about exactly what's at stake, even though I think Jesse's absolutely right, the media has tended to sort of see some of Trump's actions as distractions. They are at the core of they're at the core of some very key questions that really have high stakes for the nation. I mean, because of what's going on, the revision of history, the sanitizing of history, we are losing an inclusive public memory that we never really quite had, but we're losing a chance to have that inclusive memory. And with the loss of that memory, how can we adequately answer questions such as who constitutes the real nation? Who built and sacrificed for this country? Whose struggles matter in this country? Who's allowed to criticize the country? This historical struggle is defining the lines of those questions and debates. And to Steve, get to your point about is this unprecedented? I have a great colleague at Penn State, Joshua Inwood, who's written some fantastic work looking at the way in which Trump has weaponized heritage, history, American thought in such a way that Josh has argued that, in fact, it's part of a long trajectory of controlling the past and controlling those lines of debate. And I think the last thing I'd like to throw in here is getting at the idea of the power of place. I'm a geographer. I'm a geek. I can't help it. But as a geographer, I really pay a lot of attention to place. And so one of the things that's very striking about what we see going on is the way that the president is harnessing the power of place. That these histories are not simply being rewritten or sanitized or removed, but they are reshaping the way places look, how they function, what they mean. And I would point out to you that those changes are particularly impactful because places they have an afterlife to them. Once you create a place or you change a place, those changes stick around for quite a while. Place is one of the most powerful ways that we present the past. It has a permanence, a visibility to it. And that's being harnessed right now. And so I worry, in fact, about, well, what will it take to repair those damages to places, those damages to histories? And I think it's going to require a lot of repair, very intentional repair, and it's not going to be something that can be done overnight. I think I always say it's the last thing I say, and it never is. This is the professor in me, so I apologize. But I think I would want to end on this note in reaction to Jesse's remarks, which is that we are probably well suited or well advised that as we push back against this authoritarian trend, to actually look at commemorative issues as not just symbolic issues, but also material issues. We need to think about what sort of impact do these issues have on on the livability of our communities. I'm reminded of this. I did a study with two great colleagues in Indiana, George Towers and Pamela Morris, and we mapped out the use of Confederate place names across the South. And what we found, in fact, was that that often shaped people's willingness to live in certain neighborhoods. It also shaped people's sense of belonging and welcome within those neighborhoods. I'm also reminded of the fact of some of the work of Suzanne Ferguson, who has looked at Confederate-based place names in schools that are named for Confederate generals and founding, and she found that basically that was dramatically shaping the educational experience of students and teachers of color. And then
Mhm.
finally, I think a lot of the the material impact of these issues of history has a great deal to do with planning. So think about it this way. I work in a department where we have some of my colleagues who work in planning. They actually work in communities and help hopefully solve problems by thinking about how communities can be better planned. Well, if you have a planner who is completely unaware of past injustices, interstate highway displacement, urban renewal, segregation, and they don't understand those histories. How can they adequately plan uh, equitable, just, and healthy communities into the future? So again, thanks for allowing me to be part of this fantastic project.
Well, I just want to echo what everyone else has said, that I'm just so honored to be part of this conversation. So thank you to the Natural History Museum for having me, and thank you so much for Jesse and Derek for your really inspiring words, and also the work that you do beyond this panel. It's really really excited to be here with you. Um, so on July 3rd, President Trump, kind of leading up to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence on the eve of that birthday, made a speech at Mount Rushmore where he said that people who teach our children that they live on stolen land are not just attacking America's past, but they're attacking America's future. And I actually agree with President Trump on one of those points, which is that the way that we talk about our history, the stories that we tell about what kind of government we are, how we started, where we come from, have a profound impact on the type of country that we will be. I think one thing that to me is sometimes concerning in this moment is that sometimes it seems like the right understands that a little bit better than the left. Although there are great groups like the people who are gathered here today who are having those fights. But I think we wouldn't see the kind of attack on education, on monuments, on how we tell this history, if there wasn't a lot of power that came from that. And I think there's a lot of power that flows from the dominant narrative, the power to both shape public opinion and public policy. As an Indigenous person, and kind of the question around like, is this attack on history unprecedented? Has it happened before? As a Native person, it's very rare to find spaces that tell Indigenous history at all. I think where the history of the United States is told, most often Native people were kind of a footnote. We get passing mention, but I think other than the efforts of some Indigenous scholars and, folks who are folks, some non-Native folks who are also focused on the issue outside of kind of Native studies areas, I haven't seen very many examples of the telling of Native history that actually fully includes Native people and incorporates Native people. And I think that that's because Native history explodes the myth of the United States. It explodes the myth of, the founding fathers were perfect, they were great, everything was wonderful, rah, rah, rah. But it also explodes the version of, the US the government that the founders created was fundamentally flawed, but all of these generations have fixed it and we've made our democracy more better. Native people, we don't quite fit into that version either because we don't have the same kind of redemptive moments. There have been highs and lows in the history of Native America, but there hasn't been, big constitutional amendments or big Supreme Court decisions that have fundamentally shifted the way that colonization works and our legal subordination. And so I think that it's really important that we start to tell these histories in a more accurate way. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more as the panel continues. Because I think so much of what we're seeing in the present moment, so much of what is happening today is a direct result of these histories that we don't know. So when people say things like, this is un-American, this is unprecedented, how could this be happening in our country? A lot of what we're seeing from the current administration are things that have happened before, that our government has actually done before. It's just done it to people that we don't often talk about.
I can jump in. I really appreciate everyone's comments, and Derek, you raising this question of the symbolic versus the material, which I think we really need to reject as a false binary. And as a museum, we think a lot about cultural infrastructure and public history as infrastructure. It's more than a record of the past. It's really the space through which claims to land and authority and belonging and freedom and the future are made to appear natural. And I think the right has long understood historical narrative as a vehicle for movement building, for building power. So think about the Tea Party. They didn't invoke the founders and the Constitution and a mythic American past as decorative rhetoric. Those stories helped create a political identity that persists today. It helps define enemies and align constituencies and legitimize an agenda. So we're seeing that the right has invested really heavily in this founding mythology, in constitutional originalism, patriotic iconography, and textbooks and media infrastructure. And I think parts of the left have sometimes treated historical and symbolic struggles as secondary to quote unquote real political work. And I think that that has meant seeding an important field on which people develop shared identities and explanations and also political commitments. And so, maps, language, curricula, monuments help to organize the political meaning of material arrangements. They legitimize possession of land or determine whose sovereignty is recognized. They can define who belongs and normalize extraction or policing or deportation or dispossession. And they also teach future generations what forms of change are possible and really shape which demands appear legitimate or imaginable. So I'm not saying that renaming or representation or more, inclusive histories automatically produces justice. It's that symbolic arrangements organize material power and interventions are strongest when connected to community demands and organizing and governance and education and institutional change. I think it's really telling that the Trump administration directed the removal of materials from federal properties that, quote, inappropriately disparage Americans, past or living, or that espouse, quote, improper partisan ideology. So it really reveals something about which histories they're targeting. It's easier to detain people if we forget that our country put Japanese Americans in concentration camps during World War II. Propping up systemic racism is easier if you're whitewashing or erasing the dark histories of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, white nationalism, and so on. And also like profiteering from coal and oil extraction on public lands is easier if you're removing all mention of climate change in national parks. So I guess that's what I would close with is these counter histories, like a suppressed history becomes threatening and powerful and politically dangerous, not just because it contradicts patriotic story, but because it continues to make claims on the present. And those claims concern sovereignty and land and reparations and education and governance and belonging.
Thank you, Becca, and thanks everyone for your first comments. And I commend you all for somehow responding directly to this big bucket of questions in your 5 minutes or less. While I have my own hesitations about accepting the America 250 frame at all, engaging this anniversary as a framework for our conversation, I do think it's important for us to specifically address America 250, as they call it, directly. So what are we supposed to get out of the official America 250 narrative? What context does the official story obscure? And what other stories might help us not only see things more truthfully, but also more effectively orient our struggles against fascism and for justice today? So in other words, what stories should we be commemorating and why? And this is a big invitation for you to just weigh in on uh, the question of America 250 and what alternate frameworks we might be better off engaging or orienting our conversations around. We could start with Rebecca this time.
Yeah. We just released a podcast. There's actually still some episodes coming out in the coming weeks, but it's a 6-part documentary podcast about the founding, that's really interrogating that founding story and putting Native people back into it. And what's fascinating is that when you tell the Native part of the story actually dramatically changes. And so without Native people, it's not that our founding story is incomplete or missing, important context. It's actually just straight up wrong. So, when you read the Declaration of Independence, even, we all know the part about inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, men being created equal. But actually, the bulk of the Declaration of Independence is sort of this list of reasons why the founders are rebelling against the King of England. And the chief complaint, the main thing that they're saying, is about merciless Indian savages. And that's a story that's been covered up, but actually, from the Declaration of Independence to some of the first shots that were fired in the lead up to the Revolutionary War, one of the main drivers for the revolution itself was hunger for more native land. We mentioned the Boston Tea Party. When colonists stormed ships to throw tea into the harbor, they dressed up like Native people to do that. And it wasn't for disguise. It wasn't so British official blamed the Native population. It was actually because pretending to be Indigenous symbolized freedom and liberty for early Americans, and taking on Native identity and that kind of weird appropriation is actually part of how early Americans created an American identity and created a national identity for their new country. From why we even have a central military, why it's so big, the foundations of our property system, all of these things go back to what our country did to Native people. And I think for me in this moment, I think the most persistent myth about the founding that I think we really need to interrogate as a country in this moment is about democracy, and is this idea that our founders created a democracy. It was, it was flawed, but it was essentially a democracy. And that's only half the story. They did create a democracy, but they also created an empire because some areas of the US government, they did want to rule through consent and things like election and due process. But in other areas, they wanted to rule by force, by top-down government. And the first area was Indigenous people, but then that expanded to places like Guam and Puerto Rico. You can see echoes of it in immigration law and US foreign policy. And so when we think about, the birth of our democracy 250 years ago, we also have to see it as there was this other part of the government that our founders built, and that part of our government actually wasn't democratic. You can call it colonialism, you can call it empire, but you can also call it authoritarianism, right? It's government without consent. And I think in this present moment where a lot of people are asking, where does authoritarianism come from? How could this be happening in the United States? Or even this idea of, this is a blip in the system and it'll go away. We just have to win the next election. I think really re-examining that founding myth at this moment is critical to understand where authoritarianism comes from. That way we can root it out. And like I said, we cover this if people are interested in the podcast. First America, which is out now.
Which everyone has to listen to. Thank you so much for producing that and teaching us all so much. And I'm glad that you raised, one of the prime grievances in the Declaration of Independence is the use of the racial slur and calling Native people merciless Indian savages. I want to highlight another line that's often not understood in the Declaration of Independence, which is when they say that King George has excited domestic insurrections among us. What is he talking about? He's talking about when the Dunmore Clause was put forward that said that if enslaved African people joined the British, they could gain their freedom when the British won the war. So thousands of black people fought against the American revolutionaries because they wanted to be free, right? And the American revolutionists saw freedom as their property, freedom as the freedom to own other people. That's how they define it. So I think that Trump's Freedom 250 campaign asks us to celebrate 1776 without asking the most important question: freedom for whom? And that is the question they hope that we don't ask today. Because when the official story ever bothers to mention that slavery existed in the first place, it treats it as an unfortunate contradiction, right? The founders were just simply products of their time, and we worked out those contradictions moving forward. But that argument requires people not to know history, because the same era that produced George Washington also produced Toussaint Louverture, right? The same generation that produced Thomas Jefferson also produced the rebels in Haiti, who carried out the only successful revolution led by enslaved people in human history. This is a history that I can tell you as a history teacher is not taught very often in schools. Because if we excuse Thomas Jefferson because, quote, everyone believed in slavery back then, right? How do we explain the hundreds of thousands of black revolutionaries in Haiti who risked everything to destroy slavery? Not everyone thought it was inevitable or natural, right? And there were always people who knew this. So the founders were not trapped by their own time. They made choices that protected their own wealth and power, even as they proclaimed that to be liberty for all, right? And the official Freedom 250 narrative obscures something else. I think that Rebecca was speaking really powerfully to this. It obscures the colonial roots of fascism, right? Aimé Césaire argued that fascism did not emerge from nowhere, that it was rehearsed first with colonialism, right? And, Robin Kelly has elaborated on that as well in our own time, that before concentration camps scarred Europe, or the roundup of Japanese people, Japanese Americans during World War II, right? Indigenous people had been dispossessed of their land across the Americas, right? Before fascism perfected racial terror, colonial empires had spent centuries refining it, right? And so we hear from propaganda outfits like PragerU, the far right producer of videos for children. They have a video that asserts that, quote, America was one of the first places on earth to outlaw slavery. In another video, PragerU argues that, quote, white people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. And that, quote, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That's not history. That's pure propaganda indoctrination dressed up as education, because the truth is the United States maintained slavery longer than every independent nation in the Americas, except for Brazil and Paraguay. And then there was Spanish colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico that abolished it later as well. But black Haitian abolitionists in 1804, long before Britain or France or the United States abolished slavery. So we have to look beyond this nation if we want to look to traditions of freedom that have any real meaning. Freedom did not begin in Philadelphia. Some of freedom's brightest flames, I think, were lit by enslaved people who refused to wait for permission to be free.
That's a hard act to follow. Thank you, Jesse. But I'm going to jump in on this question of freedom and what vision's being celebrated. I think the official celebration treats freedom as a possession, like an object handed down by the founders and really embodied by the nation state. And so the histories that dozens of contributors to this other 250 map, those histories reveal freedom as something that is contested and produced from below through struggles for Indigenous sovereignty and emancipation and abolition and labor struggle, migration, cultural resurgence, all of that, right? So if the official commemoration turns freedom into heritage, counter-history restores it as a struggle and a lived practice. And I think that the official story can't accommodate that. The most disruptive histories are those that fundamentally challenge the nation's underlying premises. Indigenous sovereignty can't be accommodated because it disputes the totalness of United States authority. And Black freedom struggle can't be reduced to national progress because it exposes how freedom was achieved through organized conflict against American institutions. And abolitionists and anti-colonial traditions can't be absorbed without raising questions about property and policing and borders and governance. And so I think with place names and the official map, it's really an ideological and political artifact. It's not something neutral where some histories were accidentally left out, right? It's an instrument for making one worldview appear natural. Like, this is America, these are its heroes, this is where the story begins, this land belongs to the nation. And these are the events and people worth celebrating. So I think we need infrastructure for advancing narratives that counter that. And it's not just adding missing stories, it's really an effort to expose the authorship and that the map never was neutral, and build cultural infrastructure through which other histories and relationships and futures both become visible and also politically actionable.
Well, Becca, thanks for those comments. And Jesse, my goodness, I hear you talk and I feel like I'm run through a wall. Fantastic. And I want to pick up a little bit, if I can, for just a second on Becca's point, but also Jesse's point about freedom and problematizing the 250 narrative's treatment of freedom, which is, as Becca pointed out, it tends to be sort of framed as something that we've inherited, something we've been given by the founders. We've sort of gradually developed it further in the nation, which I think is really misleading and really an insult, frankly. Because in reality, as Becca's pointing out, freedom is not given; it's actively claimed and constructed and created by oppressed groups and the larger American nation. One of my favorite scholars and favorite phrases of the scholar is Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who has popularized the idea of freedom is a place. Freedom is a place. And what Dr. Gilmore is getting at is that freedom must be materially produced on a day-to-day basis in actual places where people live. And what she's also getting at is that freedom making, rather than being inherited or given, is something that's organized by bringing together resources and people and places and spaces, knowledges, histories, institutions, in ways that freedom is made and remade, rather than simply arriving at it or being, as I said, inherited in 1776. So I think a lot of the 250 dominant narrative that we've been hearing, Steve, your question, it obscures that work of freedom making and those specific places where freedom making happens. And more importantly, it obscures the great need for that freedom making to continue right now as we speak in our communities. And so I'm going to do something a little bit dramatic. I love the counter map that this institution museum has put together. I'm already making plans on using it in some of my teaching. But I would go even a step further than really just identifying those people, those places, those events that typically are not part of the 250 narrative. I think sometimes we need to also highlight those communities in the past who were carrying out what I would call memorial activism. They were carrying out the memory work of, in their moment, remembering and pushing against the amnesia that was at work in America at that time. And I have to be local. Again, I'm a geographer. I'm going to talk locally. Right down the street from where I live is the Beck Cultural Exchange Center here in Knoxville, Tennessee. And it was set up in the 1970s to tell the story of urban renewal in Knoxville and how it really displaced and destroyed large parts of the Black communities here in the city. Now, the Beck Center is a perfect example of one of those memory workers that really deserves to be highlighted more than what they are. Not just because they are telling us the story of urban renewal, but because they set up an institution now decades ago for the explicit purposes of forcing our city here in Knoxville not to forget the injustices that perpetuated. And so I'm also drawn to think about my now late good friend and mentor, Terrence Dix, out of Augusta, Georgia, who did a tremendous amount of reform work. And he was trying to connect place name change to material change, political change, health changes. And I'm drawn to the idea that we need to highlight some of those memory workers. We need to remember the rememberers, because with those people come lessons for us about how to do the work we need to do right now. So thanks.
Thank you all. And Derek brings up with the Beck Center the next question that I wanted to pose to y'all, which is really a question about infrastructures and institutions. It's clear that Trump's attacks, like those of decades past, are not just attacks on history, but on the institutions and infrastructures that mediate historical memory and understanding. So history has a form, right? So we could think about schools, museums, the National Park Services, the US Board on Geographic Names, and so on, right? So given the state of our institutional infrastructure, both those public agencies and the nonprofits that are uh, uh, fearful right now, what should we be fighting for right now, and through what mediating apparatuses, right? What institutions and cultural forms can help people push back against the right's attacks? And what does it look like in practice to propagate an alternate history of America from below, right? At a time like this, when the Trump administration is banning critical race theory and so on from public communications, threatening retribution to any institution that does so. And I asked this as a kind of hypothetical question, but you could also ask it as a very like real, just like practical question. Where is the good work being done? Because it is. So what forms are insurgent knowledge and history practices taking now? And how would you say they might contribute to grassroots movements against authoritarianism, settler colonialism, racial injustice, those movements that we so desperately need to build and fortify? So maybe we start this one with Becca.
Sure. We started the Natural History Museum as initially as a sort of Trojan horse strategy to get inside the museum sector and try to change it from within. It started out as a creative campaign to get David Koch, uh, big supporter of the Tea Party and a top funder of climate science denial, to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, sitting in a leadership position at a science museum. Felt like the contradiction was too great, and really pushing on museums who narrate our relationship to the natural world and each other, to talk about what's happening in the world, the really existential threats that we face. And I think that the role of cultural institutions is like there's a lot of cultural capital and resources and money and infrastructure that can be leveraged to support community-led movements, and to advance counter history, which really is future making. We are, I want to talk about like the pandemic moment, right? Many museums respond to crisis and threats, both then and now, by emphasizing neutrality, and dialogue and historical complexity and nuance and so on. But we have to recognize that official commemoration is taking sides, and the stakes are high. And institutions in the pandemic and the movement for Black Lives Matters peak kind of moment, when they exposed those stakes so clearly, retreated, many of them. And sometimes that was because they were afraid of making mistakes. Sometimes it was because of donors or trustees. And sometimes it was through a deep commitment to institutional self-preservation. And I think, again, we're seeing that today. So neutrality is not a refuge from polarization, when governments are censoring history and dismantling public participation and using heritage to legitimate authoritarian power. Really, neutrality becomes a way of seeding the field. And so I think that's the big question for our cultural institutions is, will they function as instruments of risk management, or as public infrastructure for democratic contestation? For our part, we feel like we can't rely on institutions to do this work for us, but neither can we cede institutional resources, legitimacy, and the infrastructure they provide. And we've leaned into sort of, building new institutions too. and I think the focus around counter history is like we're recovering those histories of resistance, not because the past just supplies a ready-made blueprint, but really because right now the field of political possibility is narrowed by the nationalistic kind of censored histories and the counter histories that our institutions can advance can return those suppressed experiments and relationships and refusals and victories to the realm of the imaginable for us all.
If it's okay, I'll jump in. I really appreciate this question, Steve. It's something that's been on my mind a great deal, honestly, well before the re-election of Donald Trump. And I've often thought that what we really need more of, and we see in certain communities this happening, so this is not suggesting it's not, is a more distributed and flattened ecology of memory, where we're not completely dependent on just a few major institutions to do the heavy lifting of commemorative work. Um, I still think, however, we need to keep those institutions accountable and we need to support them. As someone who works in a major institution that's had to bend and revise and modify the way it does things, I certainly would appreciate more support. And I also realize that we need to be more accountable. I think in many ways we need really a lot of grassroots efforts, and we really need to respect communities as historical actors and political agents in their own right, which one of the things I've learned so much from by studying African American commemorative activism is that long before a lot of us in institutions were having these discussions about counter history, they were already doing counter history and doing it well. I did come up with just a few ideas about some strategies in addition to the fantastic counter mapping that the museum is doing, and this idea of highlighting neglected histories. I think we need to engage in a very full-throated memory protection. We need to treat it like disaster response. We're seeing documents and websites and narratives and exhibits taken down. We need to keep track of what's being taken down. We need to preserve as much as we can of what is being taken down. I'm proud to say that one of my colleagues, Christine Johnson, who I served with on the advisory committee for place name reconciliation under the leadership of Deb Holland, we just put out a paper, in fact, that allows us to preserve the place name reconciliation principles that committee generated because we were fearful that they would be taken down off the web or disappear and no one would ever know they existed. I also think we need to continue as communities to engage in critical audits of places of memory. One of the things that came about through the Black Lives Matter movements, as well as even before then, were communities uh, taking their monuments, their memorials, their place names through a heavy reckoning, figuring out, when was that memorial created, for what purposes, why was that place named, for whom, and for what purpose. And I think we got to continue that work. We got to identify who's missing from our public memory so that we can be very intentional about getting them recognized and fighting against efforts to further erase. I think we also, this is a broken record, I apologize, we got to assess the impact of these places of memory, including the ones that are being dismantled right now, on people's material well-being. We need to find out and document how public memory and history and heritage aren't just sort of interpretations, they are structures that in fact can cause harm, and they are structures that can heal if dealt with properly and justly. Um, I think we also need to develop some principles of what I have termed in some of my work procedural justice. We need to get a full amount of the public participating in these discussions and making decisions about their commemorative landscape in ways that really, especially those communities that have traditionally not been part of those discussions. And then finally, and I think Becca might like this because we brought it up in an earlier discussion. I've become a fan of this idea of insurgent placemaking, that we have to move beyond the official sort of sanctioned event or exhibit, and we have to create sometimes spectacle, walking tours, murals, signs, stickers, things that may be very temporary, but they remind the public that there is a different history and there's a different public memory and there's a different experience and struggle that's missing from their museum or missing from their school or whatever the case may be. So thanks very much.
Um, if I can hop in, I actually kind of want to tell a story. So when we were out reporting the podcast, I visited a place in Minnesota called Fort Snelling with a historian named Nick Estes. And we were there to report on the history of the fort, which in the 1860s had been used as a concentration camp for Dakota people during the Dakota War. And when you visit there, there's sort of this big parking lot, and there are all these buildings, and you walk away and you get to this big reconstructed version of the historical fort. And, like school kids come here on field trips. It's a site of education, a tourist site. And then you walk a ways, you go down these steps, and under like a overpass for the highway on the edge of the woods is a memorial to the people who were kept in the concentration camp. And it's there, the memorial is there, but you sort of have to look at it, and it feels almost forgotten. Like when we were there, the people who were down in that area of the park were there to like go on a hike or to go cross country skiing. They weren't really, there to pay respects to the memory of what happened. And while we were there, the day that we were there, Nick got a call from his wife that ICE had just shot and killed someone. And so we just happened to be at Fort Snelling the day that ICE killed Renee Good. And the next morning, I was actually back on the Fort Snelling campus, but this time not to visit the historic fort, actually for a protest, because where ICE is headquartered in Minneapolis today is on the sort of larger campus, like across the highway from the historic fort. And it's there because it's still federal land, and it's federal land because it was once a military reservation. And so all of this history is kind of layered and stacked on top of it, on top of itself. And I truly, truly believe that, the situation that we're finding ourselves in right now politically is happening because there are these pieces of our history as a country that we've never really grappled with, that we've never really dealt with, and that we don't know how to talk about. And so, you literally have the federal government doing the same thing, rounding people up, putting them in detention as a project of ethnic cleansing, as a project of saying, we don't want to have these types of people living here in the same place. Um, in terms of where people are doing a good job, I would say that almost every tribe that I know of, I don't know every tribe, but almost every tribe has a part of the tribal government who focuses on history and preserving history. So a lot of tribes, we have our own museums. We have a lot of tribes have a tribal historical preservation officer. And so a lot of times tribes are doing that work on multiple fronts. My tribe has like a history class, we have multiple museums. And so I think like one example is Native nations, and that we've created models. When we think about sovereignty, obviously we think about sovereignty over things like land and family, but we also practice sovereignty over our history and information about us and how these stories are told. And so, and there are different types of commemorative history projects. One of the favorite things that my tribe does is that every year a group of cyclists, mostly young people, and then like a few adult mentors, bike the Trail of Tears as a way to commemorate that chapter of our history. And so the tribe, we like watch the updates on social media. They're welcomed when they come to Oklahoma. And so I actually do think there's a lot of models from Indigenous communities. And we're not the only tribe that does something commemorative event around an important and traumatic historical event. And so I think that those are solutions that other folks can look to. And I think it goes into some of what Derek and Becca were saying, where instead of waiting for these larger institutions to tell our histories, what Native nations have done is that we've built out the spaces where we're telling our own histories. And then the institutions that are doing it well and that are doing it appropriately are doing it in consultation with tribes. And that's something we're still fighting for. So there are still museums that do things like have funerary objects on display, which is like, is extremely harmful for our communities. So we're still fighting for like, museums to not have like the bodies of our ancestors in storage. Like, so we're still fighting for very basic things. But a lot of museums are starting to do a much better job where when they're creating, history about Native people, they're doing it in consultation with tribes. And so I think that that can be a model for what to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that, and for sharing that powerful story. I feel like the only reference I have is that my dad recently discovered which plantation our family was enslaved on, and getting to go down and stand on that land is a type of feeling that's impossible to describe, but it makes the history real in a way that it's different when you're just reading about it. And I think when you ask about how do we propagate alternative histories, I believe that that begins not just with identifying ways to preserve history, but really ways to democratize history. And I think it's been a great joy to serve as the director of the Teach the Black Freedom Struggle campaign with the Zinn Education Project. And we have 190,000 educators across the country who are registered at our website and who get to download free lessons from a people's history standpoint that try to tell these stories that are often left out. And our lessons don't just ask students to passively receive history. Our lessons invite students to investigate history, right? To debate history, to do simulations of history, and to discover that, the struggle for freedom has always been built by organized collectives. And one of my favorite lessons that we just came out with is called Founding Documents We Didn't Learn About. So if people want to learn more about the American Revolution from the perspective of Indigenous folks, of Black folks, whose voices are left out, we have an incredible lesson plan where students get to hear the voices and then meet each other of all these different people who had a vision for a much broader idea of what the revolution could be. And I think that authoritarianism really depends on what Professor Henry Giroux called the violence of organized forgetting, which is the deliberate erasure of the histories we need to challenge injustice. And so in my book, Teach Truth, I write about how the antidote to that is what I call the radical healing of organized remembering. And that's like a collective framework for recovering the stories that have been buried and silenced, right? Not simply just to know what happened, but so that we can recover the stories we need to get free today. And I want to just tell a quick story to end on what I mean by the radical healing of organized remembering. And this was really driven home for me my first year teaching high school back in 2010. I got hired at my alma mater, Garfield High School in Seattle, and they had me teach AP US history, right? Which, they wanted me to help these kids pass the AP test, which is not my goal. I don't care what a corporation thinks students want to learn. I wanted them to learn about the history of social movements. And so we learned about the women's suffrage movement. We did an abolitionist role play where students all become different members of a different abolitionist organization, and they have to come together in a town hall and debate what are the best methods and strategies for ending slavery. Or during the civil rights movement, the students all become members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they have to debate the real questions that SNCC had to debate. Should we recruit white college students to come down to Mississippi and join us, or will they be too out of touch with the rural black Mississippians? Should we focus on voting rights, or should we focus on direct action campaigns, lunch counter sit-ins, and freedom rides, right? So they debate these, and then they compare that to what SNCC actually did. And they engage in history as a debate, and they see that history wasn't an inevitable rolling out, that it was actually up to people, sometimes their age, who debated how to change history. Well, at the end of the year, many of them did very well on the AP exam because they actually loved history and they saw how it related to their lives. But I told them that that's not when they passed the test. The following year is when they passed the test. Because the following year, the state legislature announced that they were going to cut billions of dollars from the education budget in the wake of the Great Recession. And a group of us teachers interrupted the House Ways and Means Committee meeting where they gavelled in the session to cut the budget. And we read out the state constitution that declared education the paramount duty of the state. And we said that this was not only immoral that they were cutting money from the budget, that it was actually illegal according to the state constitution. And then I produced a pair of plastic handcuffs and I asked the state legislature to come into my custody for a citizen's arrest. And you might be shocked, but the police officer didn't have the same interpretation of the law as I did, and instead of arresting the legislature, he arrested me. So I spent the evening in jail, and the next day when I got released, I got back to school. One of my students came running up to me, said, "Mr. Hagopian, it worked." I said, "What? What worked? What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I started a Facebook page called Free Mr. Hagopian, and here you are." Right? And so I thanked him for getting me out. But then he turned the Facebook page into a page called Walk Out Against the Budget Cuts. This was a student of mine who had gone through my whole course on the history of social movements. And the next day, him and a group of those students led a walkout at Garfield of over 500 students who marched to City Hall, demanded an audience with the mayor, got their picture in the New York Times, organized a citywide walkout weeks later, and eventually the state legislature ruled in the favor of the social movement and made the Supreme Court made the legislature add billions of dollars to education. That is what the Trump administration fears. That is what all the establishment politicians fear, that young people will be empowered by the history of social movements to create their own. And so I invite everyone here to join the Teach Truth movement, the Black Lives Matter at School movement, and other efforts to recover the histories that can transform the world today.
All right. Well, thank you, Jesse, for that. Now, we intended to take audience questions. We are running short on time, but I think it was well worth it hearing this last round of questions. There are some incredible audience questions in the Q&A, so I invite you all to take a look at those and to reflect on them amongst yourselves. But I just really want to thank Derek, Jesse, Rebecca, and Becca for your contributions to this conversation and for all of the organizing work and consciousness building work that y'all are doing in your respective institutions and spaces of influence and power. So I'm going to send it back over to Becca, who's going to, say some final notes and sign you off. But thank you all so much for being here and for your attention and for joining us for this amazing conversation.
Thank you, Steve, also for guiding such a rich and really like urgent conversation. And thank you all for joining us. I want to leave you with one concrete ask. The other 250 is a living and growing project. Our goal is to build the map to 250 entries. So explore it, share it with your networks, and please share any suggestions for place name stories or partnerships to help it grow. A feedback form popped up. If today's event resonated, we'd love to hear from you. And also, we will be sharing a follow-up email with the recording and resources and links shared. And to stay in the loop for our upcoming events, you can subscribe to our email list at thenaturalhistorymuseum.org. Special thanks again to our sponsors, Mellon Foundation and For Culture, and also shout out to our production team, Raquel de Anda from the Natural History Museum and Kel Moody from Alluvium Gatherings for helping us with things behind the scenes. So with that, we're going to close with more of the song Rebuild by G.R. Grit and Sila. Thank you again. Be well, be strong, and we'll see you next time.